The Gestalt approach behaviorism thrived in the United States for several decades, although it had less influence on European psychology. G. Mandler, 2002. An important development in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century was Gestalt, pronounced Gestalt, psychology. Gestalt psychology emphasizes that we humans have basic tendencies to actively organize what we see, and furthermore, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Benjamin, 2009. Consider, for example, the figure represented in demonstration 1.2. You probably saw a human face, rather than simply an oval and two straight lines. This figure seems to have unity in organization. It has a gestalt, or overall quality, that transcends the individual elements. Fuchs and Millar, 2003. Gestalt psychologists valued the unity of psychological phenomena. As a result, they strongly objected to Wundt's introspective technique of analyzing experiences into separate components. Pickering and Rutherford, 2010. They also criticized the behaviorists' emphasis on breaking behavior into observable stimulus-response units and ignoring the context of behavior. Baddeley et al., 2009. Benjamin, 2009. Gestalt psychologists constructed a number of laws that explain why certain components of a pattern seem to belong together. In Chapter 2, we'll consider some of these laws which help us to quickly recognize visual objects. Gestalt psychologists also emphasize the importance of insight in problem solving. Fuchs and Millar, 2003, Vinay and King, 2003. When you are trying to solve a problem, the parts of the problem may initially seem unrelated to each other. However, with a sudden flash of insight, the parts fit together into a solution. Gestalt psychologists conducted most of the early research in problem solving. In Chapter 11 of this textbook, we will examine their concept of insight as well as more recent developments. Frederick Bartlett. In the early 1900s, the behaviorists were dominant in the United States, and the Gestalt psychologists were influential in continental Europe. Meanwhile, in England, a British psychologist named Frederick Bartlett, 1886 to 1969, conducted his research on human memory. His important book, Remembering, an Experimental and Social Study, Bartlett, 1932, is considered one of the most influential books in the history of cognitive psychology. Benjamin, 2009. Bartlett rejected the carefully controlled research of Ebbinghaus, Pickford and Gregory, 2004. Instead, he used meaningful materials such as lengthy stories. Bartlett discovered that people made systematic errors when trying to recall these stories. He proposed that human memory is an active, constructive process in which we interpret and transform the information we encounter. We search for meaning, trying to integrate this new information so that it is more consistent with our own personal experiences. Benjamin, 2009. Pickford and Gregory, 2004. Pickering and Rutherford, 2010. Bartlett's work was largely ignored in the United States during the 1930s because most U.S. research psychologists were committed to behaviorism. However, about half a century later, U.S. cognitive psychologists discovered Bartlett's work and admired his use of naturalistic material, in contrast to Ebbinghaus's artificial nonsense syllables. Bartlett's emphasis on a schema-based approach to memory foreshadowed some of the research we will explore in Chapters 5 and 8. Benjamin, 2009. Pickford and Gregory, 2004. Cognitive revolution. By the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s, psychologists were becoming increasingly disappointed with the behaviorist outlook that had dominated U.S. psychology in previous decades. It was difficult to explain complex human behavior using only behaviorist concepts such as observable stimuli, responses, and reinforcement. G. Mandler, 2002. Neisser, 1967. Research in human memory began to blossom at the end of the 1950s, further increasing the disenchantment with behaviorism. Psychologists proposed models of human memory instead of focusing only on models of animal learning. Baddeley et al., 2009. Bauer, 2008. The behaviorist approach tells us little about numerous psychologically interesting processes, such as the thoughts and strategies that people use when they try to solve a problem. Bechtel et al., 1998, or how people access their stored knowledge about language in order to produce a sentence. Another influential force came from research on children's thought processes. Jean Piaget, pronounced Piaget, was a Swiss theorist who lived from 1896 to 1980. Piaget's books began to attract the attention of U.S. psychologists and educators toward the end of the 1950s, and his perspectives continue to shape developmental psychology. Feist, 2006, Hopkins, 2011, Pickering and Rutherford, 2010. According to Piaget, children actively explore their world in order to understand important concepts. Gregory, 2004b. Children's cognitive strategies change as they mature, and adolescents often use sophisticated strategies in order to conduct their own personal experiments about how the world works. Research and theory from other academic and intellectual fields also increase the emerging popularity of the study of human cognition. Bermudez, 2014. For example, new developments in linguistics increase psychologists' dissatisfaction with behaviorism. Barg and Ferguson, 2000. Bauer, 2008. The most important contributions came from the linguist Noam Chomsky, 1957, who emphasized that the structure of language was too complex to be explained in behaviorist terms. Pickering and Rutherford, 2010. Pinker, 2002. Chomsky and other linguists argued that humans have an inborn ability to master all the complicated and varied aspects of language. Chomsky, 2004. This perspective clearly contradicted the behaviorist perspective that language acquisition can be entirely explained by the same kinds of learning principles that apply to laboratory animals. The growing support for the cognitive approach is often referred to as the cognitive revolution. Brunner, 1997, Shiraev, 2011. This term refers to a strong shift away from behaviorist approaches to the study of human behavior. Instead, experimental psychologists began to focus on how organism internal processes, such as memory, attention, and language, work together to give rise to the human ability to consciously perceive, interpret, and act in the world around them. We have traced the historical roots of cognitive psychology and provided a brief overview of reasons that psychologists became disenchanted with the behaviorist worldview. But when was the field of cognitive psychology actually born? Cognitive psychologists generally agree that the birth of cognitive psychology can be listed as 1956, Eysenck and Keene, 2010, G. Mandler, 2002, Thagard, 2005. During this prolific year, researchers published numerous influential books and articles on attention, memory, language, concept formation, and problem solving. In 1967, an influential psychologist named Ulrich Neisser, 1928 to 2012, published a book called Cognitive Psychology. The publication of this book served as one of the first comprehensive treatments of cognitive processing. It is seen as one of the most important factors contributing to the emergence of cognitive psychology as a field. In fact, because Neisser was the first person to use the term cognitive psychology, he has often been called the father of cognitive psychology, e.g., American Psychological Science, EEND. Cognitive psychology in present times. Since the cognitive revolution and the onset of cognitive psychology as a field, cognitive psychology has had an enormous influence on the discipline of psychology. For example, almost all psychologists now recognize the importance of mental representations, a term that behaviorists would have rejected in the 1950s. Indeed, all areas of psychology incorporate key principles from cognitive psychology in their models of human development and behavior. For instance, psychologists are also studying how cognitive processes operate in our everyday social interactions, e.g., Cacioppo and Bernson, 2005a, Cameron, Payne and Doris, 2013, Critcher, Inbar, and Pizarro, 2013, Easton and Emery, 2005, Neil, Neufeld, and Neuberg, 2013, Todd and Bergmer, 2013. Demonstration 1.3 illustrates the important influence of cognitive psychology in many other areas of psychological inquiry. Demonstration 1.3, the widespread influence of cognitive psychology. Locate a psychology textbook used in some other class. An introductory textbook is ideal, but textbooks in developmental psychology, social psychology, abnormal psychology, etc., are all suitable. Glance through the subject index for terms beginning with cognition or cognitive and locate the relevant pages. Depending on the nature of the textbook, you may also find entries under terms such as memory, language, and perception. Cognitive psychology has its critics, however. One common complaint concerns the issue of ecological validity. Studies are high in ecological validity if the conditions in which the research is conducted are similar to the natural setting where the results will be applied. In contrast, consider an experiment in which participants must memorize a list of unrelated English words presented at 5-second intervals on a white screen in a barren laboratory room. Half of the people are instructed to create a vivid mental image of each word. The other half receive no instructions. The experiment is carefully controlled. The results of this experiment would tell us something about the way memory operates. However, this task is probably low in ecological validity because it cannot be applied to the way people learn in the real world, Sharps and Wertheimer, 2000. How often do you try to memorize a list of unrelated words in this fashion? Most cognitive psychologists prior to the 1980s did indeed conduct research in artificial laboratory environments, often using tasks that differed from daily cognitive activities. However, current researchers frequently study real-life issues. For example, Chapter 3 describes how people are much more likely to make driving errors if they are talking on a handheld cell phone, Folk 2010. Furthermore, Chapters 5 and 6 discuss numerous methods for improving your memory, e.g. Davies and Wright, 2010a. Chapter 12 provides many suggestions about how to improve your decision-making ability, Kahneman, 2011. In general, most cognitive psychologists acknowledge that the discipline must advance by conducting both ecologically valid and laboratory-based research.